Thank you very much, Marian, for this very kind presentation, very generous one. Thank you to the British Academy for inviting me. Thank you, Jacqueline, for being here. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your presence. Given the current socio-political context following the recent elections in your country, which has led to a new government, I feel it might be interesting to begin our conversation by spending around, I've been told, 15 or 20 minutes addressing a question that I find fascinating, although intellectual doesn't seem to be devoted too much to it, and that I formulate in the following way: does European culture exist? I imagine that good intellectuals, such as yourselves here, skeptical and armed with the necessary humor to weather crises as well as promises, you don't expect me to provide an answer to the somewhat provocative question raised in this title: does European culture exist? Opening with such a question will allow me, nevertheless, to approach the vast continent of European culture without needing to be systematically comprehensive. I will content myself with necessary subjective vignettes, highlighting themes which I have also chosen based on my own uncertainties regarding identity, which, like those of Europe, seem to me to be both a handicap. The European identity is both a handicap and a strength. Cradle of the identity quest. This is for me Europe. I'll define it as a cradle of the identity quest. European culture has continued to unfold both the futility of this quest and the interminable possibility of going beyond it. Herein lies the paradox. There does exist an identity, mine, yours, but it is infinitely in construction, deconstruction, open and evolving. It is a paradox that confers its unsettling fragility and at the same time its vigorous subtlety on the European project as a whole and European culture destiny in particular. Who hasn't heard about this? The media breaks it down in terms of diversity, respect of singularity, of opening and closing borders, of balance between nations and globalizations, etc. I'll try to formulate it in my own more personal, say it may be inspired by psychoanalysis way. Who am I? This is a question to which Europe would best respond not with certitude, but with what I'll call a fondness for the question mark. We don't know what is the answer, but we found with the question mark. This is as far as I will venture in defining the European community in the following way. It is an indefinitely reconstructible and open-ended identity quest that acts as a counterpoint to the modern cult of identity. Everywhere in the world we have a cult of identity. People know that there are Russians, Americans, Chinese, Arabs, Jews, Muslims, men and women eventually. Here in Europe, the problem is the identity quest. In a countercurrent to this certainty, we question what we are. And it is precisely this counterpoint, the countercurrent, a contre-courant, which determines the value and the difficulty of the European culture, but also and consequently that of the European project itself. I insist on qualifying this identity as indefinitely surmountable for at least two reasons. First of all, I have experienced it firsthand as a European these past 44 years. When I left Bulgaria, Marian mentioned that, to finish my thesis at the University of Paris, with a scholarship offered by the government of Charles de Gaulle, a European who was both a skeptic and confirmed visionary, and who was already addressing Europe, as he said, from the Atlantic to the Urals, I could not have imagined, any more than anyone else at the time, that Bulgaria will join the European Union. The Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall hardly suggested that reasonable and sovereign nations would, when they stop confronting each other in ancestral battlefields, and join forces in the exchange of goods and ideas, and that the Union would establish itself, despite many hesitations and shortcomings, as the first real terrestrial space of universal peace envisioned by Kant. Coming from my obscure and still largely overlooked Balkans, my encounter with European culture convinced me of one thing that I'll summarize by saying: my identity was futile, in the sense that it is open to the infinity of the others. And it is this conviction that I want to share with you this evening, for my work in France and around the world since has served to confirm and reinforce this conviction. Put differently, the various confluents that make up European civilization, Greco-Roman, Jewish, and for the past 2,000 years Christian, followed by their rebellious child, which is humanism, not forgetting the growing Muslim-Arab presence, all those confluents, as well as the national specificities, have not reduced European culture to a handsome harlequin coat, or more frighteningly, to a hideous grinder of victimized strangers, though these extremes, such as the scourge of xenophobia and anti-Semitism, have plagued the old world and continue to haunt us today. No, this diversity has coherently crystallized in such a way that, for the first time ever, asserts an identity while opening its own critical examination and the infinity of other identities. After having succumbed to dogmas of identity to the point of crime, I think about crusades, Shoah, etc., a European we is in the process of emerging, which, as it does so, is introducing to the world a concept and practice of identity as a questioning restlessness. As we have entered the third millennium, it is possible to take responsibility for our European patrimony by rethinking it as an antidote to the tension surrounding identity, ours and everyone's. This is the second reason, which brings me back to this counter-current specificity of identity that Europe is introducing to the world. I will situate this philosophy of diverse and self-questioning identity in the concrete fields of language, nation, and freedom. In October 2005, in response to a suggestion made first by France, but also by Canada, UNESCO adopted a convention on diversity that marked a major step in the emergence of an international cultural law. It is entitled, quote, Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, while proposing, quote, to stimulate multiculturalism in order to develop cultural interaction with the idea of building bridges between people, end of quote. The convention also asserts, quote, the sovereign rights of states to conserve, adopt, and put into effect policies and measures to this end. It also defines the cultural content to be saved and developed as that which, I'm quoting, refers to symbolic meaning. The culture is not only cultural products, books, or language, or films. It's also symbolic meaning that underlies artistic, cultural, and religious dimension, cultural values which originate from our express cultural entities, end of quote. From now on, Europe is a political identity that speaks as many languages, if not more, than the countries it encompasses. To my mind, this multilingualism is the basis of the cultural and of identity diversity, which must first and foremost be protected and respected. To protect and respect national specificities. Yes, there must be also exchanges and cultural crossbreedings. This novel prospect for European men and women merits reflection and further probing. In the 12th century, Saint Bernard designated European men as an amorous subject. Maybe you remember that this French saint, Bernard de Clairvaux, interpreted for 17 years the Song of Songs, and henceforth he imagined the European subject as a man and woman in love. But he also responds to St. Augustine's argument, saying, in via, in patria, there is no other country besides traveling. So the man, according to St. Bernard, was a traveling man in love. And he came into being for the first time in the world in this 12th century by a very interesting and very challenging for psychoanalysts description when Bernard says the ego is ego affectus est. The ego is affected ego. This Christian man spoke of himself as being in love with others, but because he was in the same time crusaders, the love goes hand in hand with war. Reflection on this ambivalent relationship between love and hate, still central to religion today, may not have been probed deeply, but it was already a way of living out the complexity of the European message and the European comprehension of what the ego is. In the 17th century, Descartes revealed the ego cogito to budding science and economic growth. Along with the charms of libertine thinking, the 18th century cultivated a newfound concern for the singularity of the individual, which materialized in the declaration of the rules of man. After the horror of the Shoah, Europeans of the 21st century must now confront another era. Today, European linguistic diversity is in the process of creating what I'll call the kaleidoscopic individuals, capable of defying not only the bilingualism of the global English imposed by globalization, but also the good old francophonie steeped in Versailles Guild dreams, to become a carrying wave of tradition and innovation in this crossbreeding of languages and cultures. Little by little, a new species has been emerging, ego affectus est, ego cogito, and now the polyphonic subject, a polyglot citizen of a multinational Europe. Will the future European be a singular subject with an intrinsically plural psyche, because he or she is trilingual, quadrilingual, multilingual, or will she be reduced to a global speaker? Here is an example. I happened to be some years ago in the University of Georgetown celebrating the 50th anniversary of the creation of the Department of Languages and Literature. And the dean, who is actually a Jesuit priest, asked the question, why did we build this Department of Languages and Literature after war? It was because we wanted to respond to the Shoah, he said. And the answer was, by teaching language and literature, this is the only response to the Shoah. I have noticed that young Europeans, our students, are progressively becoming both linguistically and culturally polyphonic, perhaps much more naturally and fluently than their homologues from the other countries and continents. The foreigner is different because he speaks or she speaks another language. More and more young Europeans are going from one country to another, speaking the language of their country with that of those of the other country. In Europe, we cannot escape the condition of being foreigners. This foreignness is tacked on to our original identity, becoming the more or less permanent lining of our existence. And this encourages the question mark on the problem of identity that I spoke in the beginning. Taking a closer look at this fact, we see it is less banal than it may seem. It reveals a loaded destiny fraught with both tragedy and election. I'll take for a while my personal case. At the crossroads of two languages at least, I need an idiom which, under the smooth appearance of the Cartesian French, polished like found stone, contains a secret passion for the black gilding of the Orthodox icons. I'm almost ready to believe the myth of resurrection when I listen closely to the biffid state of my mind, of my body. And the suffering comes back to me. Bulgaria, my suffering, I said very often. Certainly, it is a painful destiny to be multilingual and to build polyphonic languages on the basis of a sort of matricide, which is particular or ephemeral or necessary abandonment of the maternal language. Yet, is not exile the only road open to us since Rabelais, in order to reach what Rabelais calls the divine bottle, to have a sense of enthusiasm somewhere, to live, to forget, to criticize, to analyze the origin, and to open oneself to the multiplicity of the others. I dialogue, therefore, with Bulgaria in my experience of the other language, but I hear also souffrance in France. For this reason, my dialogue is as much addressed to my chosen language as it is to my birth language. I wanted to develop this idea of multiple identity and questionable identity on the basis of our conception of nation and freedom, but I'll skip this in order to be shorter than I envisaged, and tell just one thing about the national pride and the national depression, because this is one of the essential questions in this multiple identity of our European space. The national pride has not fallen asleep, we know, aggravated by unemployment and outsourcing. It could rapidly turn into a kind of populist arrogance and thinly veils of laziness, a lack of motivation to move forward, etc. And then against this national pride, we have national depression. When faced with a depressed patient, the analyst begins by re-establishing his self-confidence, by restoring the patient's self-image and establishing the relationship between the two protagonists of the cure, the analysant and the analyst, for whom the words spoken become fertile. A true analysis of the suffering can take place afterwards. So we have to give us a narcissistic gratification to restore the identity of the patient in order to allow him to analyze the wounds and the traumas. Similarly, the depressed nation needs an optimal image of itself before being able to undertake, for example, European integration or industrial or commercial expansion or a better reception of immigrants. And we often forget this necessity to restore the national image before analyzing and criticizing in opening into the others. So this is also one of the tasks of the intellectuals, to be capable to understand and reconfort the national tradition before opening it to the others. The thing that I would like to emphasize, on the contrary, more than nation, maybe you can refer to this afterwards in the discussion, the thing that I would like to emphasize is the notion of freedom that we built in Europe. And I'll sustain the idea that we'll have, particularly it appeared after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we have two models of freedom, the European one and the North American. To avoid any misunderstanding, I would like to make it clear right off that we have here two different conceptions of freedom that democracy everywhere and without exception have had the privilege of using as models and elaborating. Those models are different but complementary. The recent development in French politics since the last presidential elections had made evident that far from simply opposing each other, these two models tend to moderate each other. French and European specificity tends to shift American pragmatism towards something more moderate, pluralistic that we see particularly with Obama administration. But let me precise these two models. I'll find the one of them in the critique of the pure reason, 1781, and the critique of practical reason, 1789, when Kant first defined that what other humans had probably experienced yet not formulated. This is the fact that the freedom is not, negatively speaking, an absence of constraints. Generally, we think that freedom is to be free of constraints, not to obey to something. But that freedom is positively the possibility of self-beginning, Selbstanfang. To be free is to take an initiative, to begin anew, to give a new project, to be reborn, sort of rebirth. Associating freedom with self-beginning, Kant opened the way to a defense of enterprising subjectivity or self-initiative, if I allow myself to interpret his rather cosmological thinking. Simultaneously, this philosopher doesn't fail to subordinate the freedom of reason, be it pure or practical, to a cause. He subordinated this freedom to a moral cause, to a rational cause, or to the divine cause. I'll extrapolate by saying that in a universe increasingly dominated by technology and technique, freedom has progressively become, in this direction of the Kantian notion of self-beginning, freedom progressively became the aptitude to adapt oneself to the cause, to adapt oneself to moral, economic, or rational cause, to some values, to adapt. In the best case, it would be both at once, economic, moral, or rational. Yes, there is another freedom. I'll define it as also European-made, but not very obvious in the modern technical globalized world. This second model first made its appearance on the Greek stage with the pre-Socratic philosophers and developed by the way of the Socratic dialogue. Without being subordinate to a cause, this other freedom precedes the concatenation of Aristotelian categories, which are already in themselves the beginning of scientific reason and technique. This fundamental freedom unfolds in the speaking being who delivers himself, gives himself, presents himself to himself and to the others, and in doing so liberates himself. Not only the self-beginning, but the revelation of the hidden part of myself in the encounter with the other. This liberation of the speaking being by and in the encounter with one and another was brought to light in Heidegger's discussion on the philosophy of Kant in the seminar of 1930, published under the title The Essence of Human Freedom. It is a matter of inscribing this freedom of the surprising encounter as a kind of infinite questioning in the essence of philosophy before the freedom becomes fixed, but only subsequently in the chain of causes and effects and its mastery. To give you an example, the example of this delivering of the subject into the encounter with the other through the language, by interrogating the language and it's himself or herself, we can give an example in some figures that we know. For instance, the poet, the artist that changes the models of expression, the libertine, and also the revolutionary. In my book on the revolt, I tried to explain how I understand the revolt not only as an exigency to more or best, but as a turning back into the past and developing the identity into an open quest for the future. You know this notion of revolt even in the Sanskrit root of vel, which is in the Latin words like revolt. Vel in Sanskrit meaning return to the front, unveiling, going back to the source, refoundation, revelation. So this kind of revolt, we find it also in the Freudian transference and this kind of dialogue where the protagonists are supposed, through a free association, to rebuild themselves, to open themselves, and to raise themselves. Now, the issue of such kind of freedom is concentration of the value into the experience of a singular person. The person as a singularity, as an experience of uncommensurable singularity. This is something that we know from the theology. For instance, Duns Scotus' notion of the exeitas, the thisness. The truth is not the real, the reality. The truth is not the concept. The truth is this man, this woman, the singularity of each and every person. But this is something that politically and philosophically we can maybe achieve in the development of modern democracies and the wealth that we have built on the material, but also on the philosophical level. I'll not finish this presentation without touching very briefly a question that is very essential for me now, which is a crucial question. It belongs to this European quest for a singular truth, for singular development, the protection of the singular development and its possibility to be shared with the other in the public space. In this scope, there is a very important question, which is the transvaluation of the religious tradition. And this is something that is also a European challenge, to which European philosophy is perhaps more prepared to contribute than any other approach elsewhere. Let me say some words about how I personally understand and practice my own participation to this immense work of transvaluation, the religious tradition. I'll sketch this very briefly by some small remarks. A new conception of the human is in a process of being constituted after the French Enlightenment produced a tremendous break into religious tradition by opening the way through the encyclopedia to the human sciences. And I had the chance to belong to one decisive moment of the development of the human sciences that you know under the name of structuralism, post-structuralism, and also psychoanalysis. With all these experiences, we're trying to propose what I'll call a new humanism, where transcendence is immanent, which means that the meaning is a conception that is synonymous with the desire for meaning, which is inseparable from the pleasure rooted in sexuality and in the search for meaning, and which commands both the sublimity of culture but also the brutality of acting out, because when we are searching for meaning, we can reach, from one hand, the sublimity, but also cruelty in that ends. It is clear that today the intellectual is confronted with a difficult historic task commensurated with the crisis of civilization. It is neither more nor less than a matter of coaxing this new type of knowledge to emerge progressively. We should not hesitate to use technical terms, but we have also to use some colloquial language in order to bring this process of trying to transvaluate religion to a larger public. What we'll have to do in order to do this? We have to invent new object of investigation, to create new objects for human sciences. And that's what you do when we approach, for instance, psychosis, borderlines, autism, sublimation, but also belief, nihilism, passion, gender, mental madness, hate, motherhood. All those new fields of investigation brings us to be able to transvaluate this field that we inherit from and that is called tradition. In order to clarify my position, I'll give just a final example and I'll stop here. Maybe you remember that some years ago, I think it was in 2004 or 5, a very interesting debate took place. It's a debate between my friend, the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, and the Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who was not a pope at that time. They have remarked what they called a failure of the rationalist humanism in the 20th century. The rational humanism failed into totalitarianism, they noticed, and that announced that this rationalist humanism would fail again in the economic and biological automatization of species. So they pronounced a sort of condemnation of this rational humanism, and they envisaged a necessity to find out a higher authority. I'm quoting from their dialogue. A higher authority which they say alone can regulate the frenetic pace of liberty. This liberty that I think is essential for our civilization, be it an adaptation to the economic rules or be it a revelation of what is unknown in every one of us. So this joint declaration by the philosopher and theologian implies a return to faith as the only recourse possible to establish the moral stability required in order to face the risks of freedom. In other words, they say, since constitutional democracy need normative presuppositions in order to found rational law, that's what has been thought by a famous German lawyer, Böckenford. We need in our Western democracy, in order to found the rational law, a sort of unifying normative presupposition, a unifying bound. And this unifying bound could constitute, they say, a conservative consciousness. What you have to do in order to find this unifying bound on the basis of conservative consciousness? You have, Habermas says, nourish the faith and we have been nourished by faith. And Hatzinger says we have to find out the correlation between reason and faith. In a very, pretentious, hyperbolic way, I will propose to counterbalance this hypothesis. And I'll suggest we consider that we are already confronted, notably in advanced democracies, with what I call the pre-political and trans-political experience, which renders obsolete this normative consciousness and the return to faith. Because we have deconstruct, reconstruct, and remodel this classical opposition between faith and reason. Where this reconstruction happens? It happens when we decided not to consider the irrational as unthinkable, when the irrational was integrated in the field of what can be rationalized and thought about. And that's what Freud did when he put the irrational in the unconscious. This is the one thing. Another problem, the other field, when the faith, the realm of faith was introduced into the scope of thinkable. It is to consider that the language possesses, that's what we did in an important period, I think, of post-structuralism, that language possesses a level that we call a semiotic, which encompasses instinctual drives, sensations, which is pre-linguistical, and I distinguish itself between the semiotic from the symbolic. The symbolic is language, and instinctual drives and sensations are pre-symbolic. And the working through these two levels of language is precisely the field of artistic experience, of style in language, but also of drawings, painting, filmmakers, singing, dancing, etc. All this human experience that is called art, if you don't consider it as a decor, but as an experience, encompasses the realm, one aspect, maybe not the whole, but I dare to say this, of what is considered to belong to the faith. And the other one is, of course, the necessity to interpret continuously, to ask, to be found of, not of the absolute, but by the interrogative mark, to put in question every kind of absolute. So in this framework, when we know that God is unconscious, that style maintains body, that the verb is filled by the flesh, and that it's possible to think about it in an interrogative way, I think that we are belonging to a great trend of the European culture that has been also pointed as a specific achievement of our civilization by Hannah Arendt, when in a discussion with the transcendentalist of the Notre Dame University, she said that when people make the divine a value, or even a supreme value, they are as nihilistic as nihilists are. So the idea is that the transvaluation of tradition is on the way, and it is something that the European culture is trying to pursue, maybe in the most fertile way. Now, I'll finish by saying that I'm fully aware also of the dead ends of European project, of the particular moment in which we are in Europe and in the world. I'm fully aware of the catastrophe that may await us in the third millennium, the calculated devastating of minds, the automation of species, the ecological apocalypse. Yet my bet for Europe is not a facade of optimism without cause. I want Europe to be fortified against danger that assails us from all sides and from inside of ourselves also. But I wanted just to draw level with potentiality of our culture, the risks and promises of which we are able to appreciate today. And thank you very much for listening to me.